The Annex Sociology Podcast is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more, visit queenspodcastlab.org.
This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Ellen Meiser with the University of Hawaii. With me is Na Tan from the City University of New York. And today we have a special guest with us from the University of New Mexico, Assistant Professor of Sociology, Dr. Eli Wilson, who is here to talk with us about a topic that Na and I are very interested in and write about ourselves, which is the culinary industry. Specifically social inequalities and boundary maintenance in restaurants between kitchen staff, which we call the back of the house, and wait staff, which we call the front of the house. And he's also here to talk about his upcoming book on the topic, which will be published by NYU Press, titled Front of the House, Back of the House. So Na and I, like I said, we're really curious about the culinary industry as well as the process of turning a dissertation into a book, which you did with this upcoming publication. So those are going to be the topics of our conversation today. This was recorded on September 1st of 2020. And before we start, I just want to thank you for meeting with us and talking with us. We're really excited to have you.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to both Nan and Ellen for this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so our first question that we have for you is just how did you get into doing research about food workers, the culinary industry? Where did the inspiration come from?
Gosh, I think I've had an interest in this stuff for a very, very long time. I've always been around food. And, well, let's see. I could probably tell this story a few different ways. I was somebody who, out of college, I was a sociology major, psychology double major. And at the time, as a wide-eyed 21-year-old coming out of Wesleyan University in Connecticut, I thought I was going to be a professional brewer. Just like so many people of my generation, perhaps, especially white-appearing men. And I thought I wanted to work in a craft brewery and eventually maybe own my own small brewery. And so the logical thing to do was to see what kind of opportunities I could get within the restaurant industry or the food and beverage industry. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened at the time, two of my older cousins had just opened a small restaurant in Los Angeles, and I was completely enamored with the idea of working for a restaurant. And me having no experience, but having a newly minted college degree, I was thinking, oh well, that's great. I'll just slot right in there in management, and really help him with high-end tasks and the running of a business. And I think that my cousins, when I went out to LA, I think they did me a tremendous favor by throwing me at the very bottom of the restaurant hierarchy. So when I first got there to the restaurant, I was bussing tables. I was running food. I was, I was fraternizing with people in the back of the house, working in the dish pit. I was doing nothing that had anything to do with management and all these higher level, higher skilled tasks that go on within restaurants. And I think that was my first entree into kind of the world of work that goes on behind the scenes in restaurants. And so much, as somebody who was already prior interested in sociology and psychology, so much happens behind the scenes that's of interest to those of us who study this as a profession. But at the time, it wasn't my focus to study this stuff. It was just my focus to understand it, to be a part of it, to not fall on my face. And I became interested in a number of issues related to what I was seeing.
Was the culinary industry your kind of sight from the very get-go when you started your PhD? Was that on kind of the forefront of your mind, or did that develop as you were getting close to dissertation phase?
Yeah, looking back, I think I was perhaps one of the lucky ones that came in with knowing what I wanted to study and was able to seamlessly integrate, my set of interests, intellectual interests, with, some of my experiences, my social experiences, and then ultimately into a research agenda. So I think I was very lucky in that regard. And so, just to finish up on bringing to, into my experience as a graduate student, from those early years where I was just in the trenches working 5-6 days a week in restaurants, with no real thought to study and write about these topics, it quickly became apparent to me that I had questions that when I was sort of in the weeds, to use an industry term, I just didn't have time to think about. One of the most interesting questions to me, one of the most puzzling questions to me, again, this is well prior to my graduate school education, was why are all of the Mexican and Central American, primarily immigrants, working one type of job, whereas the people who are lighter in skin color, are more from college, have college degrees, are typically younger, why are they all positioned in other types of roles? And I, of course, given my social characteristics, was very much a part of that latter group. But I think what interested me is in the absence of any formal credentials needed to work as a server or in my case, cashier at that first restaurant, or in any other position within that type of restaurant, why do we see such segregation of labor, right? Yeah. And in specific, what seems to be preventing people, Latino immigrants, maybe a Mexican immigrant man, who does speak English, maybe with an accent, but does ultimately speak English. What is preventing that individual from gaining or from accessing positions where he could make substantially more money, sometimes twice as much money, working a tipped front of the house job as a server or bartender? What is preventing that individual from ultimately accessing a job that should be in his or her, but in many cases it was a his experiences, accessing these positions that seem to be rationally, economically in their interest? So sort of what was going on in this setting? That was one of my early puzzles that I wanted to unpack.
And so as somebody who has read your dissertation, that's one of the puzzles that you talk about and you solve. Is that the same line of inquiry in your upcoming book, Front of House, or Front of the House, Back of the House?
I'd say in a nutshell, yes. Although, as many sociologists well understand, it's always more complicated than it might initially seem.
Yeah.
I remember when I first posed questions of that nature that I just described to my early dissertation advisors and some of my kind of mentors as a grad student, the answers I was getting were sort of rudimentary. It was maybe it boiled down to racism and hiring discrimination solely, based on maybe just the color of their skin, perhaps. Maybe it had to do with formal credentials. Maybe these are jobs that require a degree of specialized training, that they require a college degree. Hence, if you don't have a college degree, you have a kind of a form of labor inequality based on that kind of credential, right? And so on and so forth, with these fairly logical, explanations, theories as to why we might ultimately see this sort of ethnic division of labor, ethnic and racial division of labor, amongst other things. And but yet, myself as a grad student, as I continued pursuing this work, I realized that the story was so much more complicated than that. On the ground level, being in the trenches with these individuals, so to speak, 5-6 days a week, it never seemed as simple as that. For instance, I saw managers and front of the house workers actively encourage Latino immigrants to apply for these types of jobs. I saw one particular instance, which I recount in the book, where one foreign-born Mexican man was able to access a job first as a bartender, then for a brief short of time as a manager, and elected, in his own recounting of the story, elected voluntarily to go back to bussing tables and running food for reasons that were entirely on his own. So, as many sociologists, like I said, are aware, often, what one's initial theories are insufficient to explain just how much ground level noise and complexity there is going on. And I certainly found that to be the case within restaurants.
All right. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your upcoming book, since we're on the topic? If you have any more to say.
Sure. Well, I'm really happy to see this book finally come out. It's been years in the making, as are many projects I'm sure we'll talk about later that involve years and years of field work as a graduate student, and then this being the fruition of that. In this particular book, I spent 6 years working within three kind of higher end restaurants within Los Angeles. So I was interested in exploring more than just one, because I wasn't interested in just telling an idiosyncratic story and sort of blowing that up to be something that was much greater than it actually was. I wanted to see variation based on a different service brand, as I call it, or a different way of internal organization within these restaurants, just to see if that played out in some differences in terms of the race, class, or gender makeup of who does what jobs within restaurants. Ultimately, the sort of the gist of the argument that I'm trying to pitch is that if we really want to understand social inequality in these settings, it's not just the role of management sort of imparting these forces of inequality top down, but there's something going on between workers. There's kind of this dynamism of boundary making and understanding difference, and ultimately, kind of making sense of who does what job within restaurants and the logic that accompanies that particular division of labor. So again, it's a much more complex interplay that involves both managers and the way in which they structure inequality based on their hiring standards, their supervisory methods, but also some of these ground level sort of bottom up forces of group difference making coming from workers themselves. And also, I might add, customers too, right? Oftentimes, as other scholars have studied, when we're dealing with service environments, we're not just talking about workers and managers, we're also in a very important ways dealing with customers and their standards and their types of interactions that they impart, especially customers that are more affluent and thus have power in these situations. So, so the book really digs into all of these meaty forces of social inequality, while I hope providing a little bit of humanity to the lived experience of all of those individuals within each of the restaurants that I worked at.
Did you do ethnography, or did you also interview all these workers and customers in I do not really know what kind of questions you would ask to get some answers about social inequalities, right? That's something that I'm really interested in.
Sure, yeah. So I would say for this project, the bulk of my data is coming ethnographically, is really participant observation, kind of the classical methods of that. And I spent a lot of time in the field, just copious amounts of field notes, and jotted down record of informal conversations, observations, things that I experienced kind of reflexively in the field. But in really important ways, I think that interviews, particularly in-depth, open-ended interviews, were a really valuable supplement to that data. As you can imagine, there are certain types of things I wanted to know about how workers felt about their job, how they felt about each other, their aspirations that they had for themselves in this type of setting that were difficult to glean, again, kind of in the trenches, doing this work, often on the clock, while trying to ultimately do the task of restaurant work and restaurant service. So the interviews for me provided a really important space to meet up with these workers outside of work and allow them to elaborate. What are they experiencing, right? What do they want out of their jobs in restaurants? How did they get this job? How did they feel about their coworkers? By the end of the project, I was actually meeting up with these workers and bouncing some of my pet theories about what was going on off of workers themselves and going, hey, does this make sense to you? right? Is this consistent with your experience, or do I need to go back to the drawing board here?
Mm-hmm.
So again, at least in the way that I did this ethnographic research, the in-depth interview component of it was a really valuable supplement to help me better understand what was going on in the setting.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea that customers also reinforce this kind of occupational line, so to say, or they are part of this boundary making process. How does it work in these upscale restaurants? And because I have read some work about Yelp reviews, right? Do these customers also go on to the internet and say stuff about workers at these restaurants, especially when they are wealthy customers? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of Yelp, which was always something that anyone who's worked in restaurants, whether it's in management or as just frontline employees, you're very aware of these reviews. And it's funny when you talk to restaurant workers, restaurant managers, oftentimes they get a little bit defensive about Yelp. Several times when I was interviewing managers and owners of these restaurants, they would say, well, I don't really care about what's said on Yelp. Very dismissively. And to me, that tended to signal that they cared very much what was being said about their restaurants. And of course, there was other managers who were aware of what Yelp meant, were kind of resigned to the fact that this was a component of their business that they had to monitor. If they cared about their brands, which I argue in their book, they spent a lot of meticulous time crafting what I call their service brands. These different versions of upscale service offered within these restaurants, well, then they have to care about what customers are saying. What are they experiencing, even in a very problematic medium like Yelp, at least from their perspective. So I think there's a couple of components here in terms of going back to your original question about the influence of customers in the setting. First of all, it's important to note that customers bring to this setting all kinds of expectations about what the kind of service they're going to receive, expectations about what the person who is going to be providing that service is going to look like. Right? So as many other sociologists have written, customers very much reinforce these kinds of embodied, maybe aesthetic standards for workers themselves. Right? So customers therefore function as kind of second managers in a way for these workers that you have to, you as a frontline service worker, especially in restaurants, need to be aware of not just the impression you're making on supervisors, but oftentimes the impression you're making on customers. And one example in a restaurant that I refer to as the neighborhood in my book, where you have a situation where customers this is a luxury setting, and the customers who come in are of such great affluence. These are individuals that are very oftentimes fabulously wealthy. I can't name any names, obviously, but this was a very kind of to be seen setting with a very wealthy clientele. And in that particular environment, the relative power between workers and customers in terms of the core service interaction is particularly skewed. Right. And I had situations, even while I was there, where workers were fired outright, not because of anything that I could tell as somebody working alongside them that they had done wrong, but merely because customers, or a particularly wealthy, powerful customer, had made a small nudge, maybe on their way out of the restaurant, saying to a manager, hey, that server who took care of me, I didn't like his or her tone. It was sometimes that subtle and that, but that devastating in terms of what that might mean for a worker. And as we can imagine, the way customers perceive workers, going back to what I said earlier about their standards and cultural expectations, these are done in very much racialized, gendered, and classed ways. to the extent that customers expected somebody who was quote unquote well-spoken, who looked the part, I'm using air quotes here, looked the part, to be interacting with them, serving their $50 steak or their $25 glass of Merlot. And that was part of the experience they wanted, to the extent that those individuals tended to cluster around traits that we would associate with whiteness, with upper middle classness as a cultural characteristic. Perhaps with youth in other settings. That's maybe something I don't emphasize as much because of the environments that I was doing my research in, but certainly in other restaurants, youth being a big characteristic that customers are looking for and bringing those standards, with them to dine, but ultimately having those standards result in labor standards in very problematic ways as management picks up on that and makes decisions about who to promote and who to hire.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you're talking I was thinking about a topic that I'm totally fascinated with, which is restaurants that are like inherently mean to their customers. When wait staff is just so nasty, but that their food is so good that you're willing to put up with, the auntie who's going to yell at you for ordering the wrong thing or not giving her enough tip,
Absolutely.
And that's another thing where customers also, they seem to be, no matter what your status is as a customer, whether or not you're, rich or poor or anything in between, like they don't care.
Well, I love that you raised that issue, because I think that we've all been to restaurants where the wait staff or the bartenders might be kind of surly, and you put up with it because you really want to be there for other reasons. But I would also emphasize that for some restaurants, that kind of surly quality, that standoffishness, is actually part of their very service brand. They're well aware that their staff, at least their front of the house staff, is providing this kind of service, and it's something that they maybe actively encourage. They certainly don't. They don't chastise, and it's kind of baked into what it means to go to that particular service. The name of a restaurant that does this is escaping me at the moment, but there is one well-known national.
Is it you walk up and it's a place where you order at the window and you pick up your food and they like yell at you, they curse at you, they tell you you're ugly. Definitely. Yeah, there's been a few. I've seen a few like news reports and YouTube videos about this place.
Yes. Yeah. So again, I don't think there's anything unique about that. And I think a better way, a more sociological way to approach it is to think about the production of distinct service brands. Again, because being a restaurant in today's environment is hyper competitive. You're trying to distinguish yourself.
I was thinking when you guys both talked about experiences at restaurants where you were yelled at by the waitstaff. I think my first experience having that was in Germany. The first time I went there as like study abroad program and whatnot. And wait staff didn't bring my food out, and I was complaining. And then my professor was sitting next to me and trying to use it as a teaching moment immediately. And he was like, look at this. In Germany, all the staff are unionized, so they are more willing to argue with customers if you are on order. And at that point, it didn't stick to me so much until like 2 years later when I actually lived there and I experienced it on a daily basis. And I was like, oh, that actually makes sense. And then the tip system in the US was not in Germany, right? In Germany, at the restaurants that I frequented, then the tips were divided equally among the staff. And so it doesn't matter if you're the front stage kind of staff or backstage, you're both getting some tip.
Sure. Were you talking about in the US or in Germany?
In Germany, when I was living there, and that's what I observed. And so they're also more willing to argue with customers, so to say. That's just like, and maybe that's a question about staff unionization. Do you think that's gonna help with these inequality issues in the culinary industry?
Yeah, so the issue of unionization in restaurants is a super vexing one. I mean, just to to be blunt about it, it's as you both are well aware, the rate of unionization amongst private restaurant workplaces is incredibly low, and that is highly problematic, as you can imagine, for workers. It means lack of security. It typically means all sorts of things that are associated with a non-union workplace involving precarious work. You raise the issue of kind of what might the future hold, I think, for unionization, or could this be a potential solution to some of these issues of inequity? My sense is, well, the short answer would be yes, but I think the way that we get there faces a lot of roadblocks to the rollout of unionization in today's restaurant industry. I'll give you an example, because I was involved during this project with a wonderful organization called ROC. So that's Restaurant Opportunities Center. Restaurants Opportunity Center United, so ROCU. And ROC at the time, their LA branch, so to speak, that I was kind of attending meetings and I got to know some of the heads of that organization. They were facing an issue where most of the individuals who were attending ROC meetings and were getting, were getting very outspoken about the need to raise awareness about a number of issues related to restaurant work and so on and so forth, where they were getting some purchase amongst kind of immigrant workers. They were, of course, struggling to get more undocumented immigrants to kind of make a more public gesture for obvious reasons. But there was a good deal of their membership core membership was coming from immigrant workers working in restaurant full time. And one thing that I found really interesting is that there were very few sort of white educated workers that I associate with front of the house work who were attending these meetings at ROC. And so I thought about it a little bit more, and I kept seeing these patterns as I'd go to these meetings and I'd look at who was attending and also very much who was not attending these meetings. And I realized that I think that I came, my working understanding of this is that there may be a cultural disconnect, right? If educated, so privileged, white, young workers, college educated, don't see restaurant work as a quote unquote real job, and they see it as something that's part-time, that they're going to do for a very short bracketed period of their life, that they approach as maybe one of many other activities that they are also engaged with, then I guess there's a practical issue. Sort of, why take this serious? Why invest in the way that one would need to invest? Hitting the streets, maybe attending protests or rallies, raising awareness, risking one's job, if you're not planning on staying in the industry very long anyway. And so I think that there's some really vexing issues related to it, the prospects for unionization amongst all restaurant workers, at least in this higher end sector. I do think there's different issues at play amongst fast food workers that may mean that there's greater likelihood on that front for unionization. But at least amongst higher end kind of private restaurant workplaces, I think that there are certainly a number of challenges.
Yeah. I mean, in my own research, I've talked to chefs and restaurant owners about things like tip pooling and service fees and stuff like that, to not really unionize, but to kind of equalize the difference in pay between front and back of house. And there, like you said, there are so many roadblocks that are even like legal roadblocks where tip pooling can be construed as wage theft under certain state laws. Like I think New York is one of those states that actually can prosecute a restaurant owner for wage theft if they engage in tip pooling. So it has to be totally organized by the staff themselves. But if, like you said, staff are not thinking of these jobs as long-term jobs, and it's a very transient industry to begin with, then who's really going to be willing to organize all of that and convince people to pool their tips and all of these things. So like you said, I think that the transient nature really works against people in terms of equalizing things.
You're absolutely right about that. And, something I would add is, I write in my book about the fact that this deep irony, this kind of cruel irony, that oftentimes some of the workers that are most committed to making a career in restaurants, working full time, developing their skills, and being committed either to the leadership of that restaurant or the restaurant itself, are the ones that are least able to access the better positions. Specifically, I'm talking about many of the immigrant Latino workers, both who are operating in what I call support jobs, or otherwise known as busing and food running, or in the kitchen, working as line cooks and not basically non-chef positions within the kitchen. Some of these individuals that I talk to are absolutely devoted to remaining in the industry, and this is where they want to be. They've done it for decades. They've done it 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Sometimes they've invested their own money in their equipment, such as knives and other kitchen tools and equipment. And yet they're sometimes the ones that are least likely, for reasons that I talked about earlier, to be able to access jobs that can give them better wages, and maybe more visible positions, just and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
No, I mean, it's interesting to see people navigate it, and I think especially with the pandemic, which is something that I wanted to ask you about with your field sites. It's going to be interesting to see how the restaurant industry maybe revamps itself after having this giant kind of devastating lull in business and activity. So I was wondering, have you been following up with your study subjects during the pandemic, or with your field sites, like you mentioned, the neighborhood match? Is it terroir?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always hard to say that.
Yeah. Have you kept up with them? How is the pandemic affecting them? And do you also see, if you have been, a divide between front and back of house in the treatment of employees during this time period?
Sure. So I wrote earlier back in March, when the pandemic really started to kind of accelerate and the effects were starting to grow wider and wider. The restaurant industry was one of the worst hit early on. Now months in, I suppose it almost seems like, threading hairs to say who's been hit worse. There's been such widespread, devastation due to the pandemic. But certainly back in March, it was very clear that those types of jobs that relied on person-to-person contact, many service jobs, restaurants in particular, were tremendously impacted in the form of closures and shutdowns that had a kind of indefinite timetable. And one thing I was emphasizing in a piece I wrote back in March is that nonetheless the effects within restaurants were felt in very unequal ways. And a couple examples. One would be, certain workers were able to be laid off and access unemployment, and as there was an extra pot of money coming from the government to support unemployed workers. But those benefits, federal benefits, were not being extended to undocumented workers, which we know are a big component of the restaurant industry, particularly in LA. And other major cities in this country. And so we were seeing this, really the rug pulled out from underneath workers who are already in many ways the most vulnerable population within restaurants. And so, that was a population that was starting to fall back on already vulnerable social networks out of desperation, and with very little recourse in a very scary way. And I think there were some advocacy groups in LA that were trying to draw attention to their plight. That is the plight of undocumented restaurant workers in particular. In a very different way, I also was observing, and this was from some conversations I had with some of the individuals who were in my study in the front of the house, I was also observing that front of the house workers were being hit very badly. They were not in as socially vulnerable a position, as I mentioned earlier, because they tended to be more educated, white, class privileged, those sorts of things. But in terms of their the status of their jobs, these were the kinds of jobs that were absolutely obliterated. That is front-of-house jobs, so customer-facing jobs within restaurants and food and eating establishments. These are the kind of jobs that were absolutely obliterated, right? So that is to say, when more restaurants move to a takeout model, for instance, or DoorDash and that kind of gig economy food service, none of that involves front-of-the-house workers. You might have a limited contingent of cooks that retain employment, managers that retain employment, but certainly not frontline servers, bartenders, hosts, and some other positions, cashiers. And so this was what amounted to be an employment Armageddon for those individuals. And I'm sad to say I have not in the months since sort of followed up and kept tabs as to sort of where are they now. I wish I had. But I think it's a very important question, as those jobs are starting to come back, but also may not have the same level of tips. They may not mean the same thing. Hours could be different. There's a number of other changes that I'd imagine have taken place.
Yeah. I'm very curious what's going to happen with the whole industry after, maybe over the next 3-4 months when this continues to linger and they try and figure out how to reshape their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one last thing I'll add to talk, speaking of the pandemic, since it's it's on everybody's mind within the restaurant industry as well as a number of other industries. I would also add that, in terms of the restaurants that are surviving and possibly even thriving in this moment, because there are some, they tend to be restaurants on the lower end of the spectrum. Fast food, quick service, some casual dining setups that have a nice outdoor space where they can continue to do business. The part of the sector within the restaurant industry that is still really struggling is the very sector I studied. We're talking about full service, higher end restaurants. Restaurants that prize themselves, train their staff, built their brands on customer hospitality and providing a really curated experience both on the plate, in the drink, and also in terms of what you're going to experience in terms of that person-to-person hospitality. The devastation is apparent. Every city that I know of in this country is seeing massive closures amongst that sector. Some of the more prominent restaurants in the city are really, really struggling in this time.
Okay, all right. So we're going to kind of switch gears here and talk to you about the process of turning a dissertation into a book. So like I mentioned, Serving Across the Divide, that was your dissertation. You defended that in 2017, and you are coming out with a book in a few months, so 2020. So 3 years. In my mind, that's a very fast turnaround because it takes me, 4 weeks to write an abstract for something. So can you talk a little bit about kind of turning that dissertation into a book proposal, I'm assuming, and then into a manuscript? Walk us through that process.
Sure. Yeah, trying to think of, where to start. And I haven't given this a ton of thought, but I certainly have a lot of experience, in terms of going through this process very recently. I think one of the best things that, certainly something that helped me, but I also think it's more generalizable advice, is the sooner as a graduate student working on your dissertation, you can think about how do you want this dissertation to sound like a book, right?
Okay.
So that might involve simple steps, like what are some books that you really love to read and that you would ultimately want your own product, your own dissertation turned book to sound like, to feel like, to evoke certain kinds of emotions, intellectual or otherwise. I mean, I think that's really important to consider as early as possible, because I think it shapes the way that you approach the writing process. It approaches the kind of ease and accessibility that you are trying to achieve for a very particular audience. I knew early on that a book was my goal. Mm-hmm. I knew as I was writing my dissertation that I wanted this to be a book, and I wanted this book to be read not only by specialized sociologists of work and race and inequality, but also by a general, educated audience. Call it like a New Yorker audience. That was something told to me early on in my career. And with that in mind, I think that it informed my decisions on how to write that dissertation. And so, I think I got a little bit lucky in the sense that I was told that advice, and not only was I told that advice, but that the content, there was such continuity, even from going in, knowing I was going to write about restaurants, understanding early on I was going to turn this into a book, and then understanding that, once I passed the dissertation phase of my graduate career, I was, all eyes focused on turning this into a book, and had a lot of support from other people in that process. So I do think that a little bit of luck came in there, and I certainly, for those of you who are still graduate students, hearing this, I wouldn't get too discouraged if your own trajectory involves maybe a few false starts and kind of simultaneous sort of 1 foot forward, two steps back kind of thing. I think that's more normal, and I acknowledge that I had some good luck on my side in having everything streamlined.
So can I ask how long it took for you to shop around a book proposal until you got a set deal? Or was that relatively quick? I'm assuming because you said you were lucky, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I definitely think the earlier you can get started on thinking about that book prospectus, targeting a certain press. Once again, I would encourage you to think about where are the books that you like to read, academic books that you like to read, where are they coming out from? And start to recognize some of those presses, right? Get to know some of those names. I say that because for me, that was a very foreign world. I was not used to opening the first page of a book and looking at that imprint. Right? These are things that as a graduate student, it certainly didn't occur to me to do. Getting to know, having conversations about, who are the editors of which press, right? And starting to familiarize with that world. So I think there's certainly a learning curve there. But I would encourage any graduate student interested in going through that that arc from dissertation to book. Get started thinking about that prospectus. Challenge yourself to give an elevator pitch for what this book might sound like. Try out a few rough drafts of how would I convey why this book is important and urgent and valuable right now, right? And I got 2 paragraphs to convey that in, say, a book prospectus or whatnot. I think it's a really valuable intellectual activity. I think that it's sometimes some of how you learn to think about your project can filter back into better thinking about the dissertation itself and some of the core arguments you're trying to make. And to your question about timeline, if I remember, things are getting a little bit fuzzy here, but if I remember right, once I defended my dissertation, the next words after congratulations out of my advisor's mouth were, okay, now let's get to work turning this into a book.
Okay.
So let's get you started on writing the prospectus. Let's start making some of those edits that were coming from the committee. Everything, of course, geared towards thinking about it like a book product.
And so when you're thinking about turning your dissertation into a book, how, I guess, because when you look at any type of sociological literature that is narrative driven, which I'm assuming yours is going to be because your dissertation had narratives throughout, usually you'll see the methods chapter pushed into an appendix. you have things moved around to make it more kind of reader friendly to that New Yorker audience that you're talking about. So what were some tactics that you used to make the book more of a book versus
oh boy,
a study?
I wonder if I'm going to get myself in trouble here, because I do acknowledge there are different ways to do this.
Okay.
And so, if I'm going to have a cop-out answer, which I'm not, but a cop-out answer would be, well, talk to your advisor.
Okay.
But I'll see if I can go a step further beyond that. I think that for me, the question related to methods that I kept asking myself was, does this detail about my methods that I use to collect this data, does the reader need to know this detail in order to better understand the story?
Mm-hmm.
And I emphasize story, not the idiosyncrasies of data collection or some technique.
Yeah.
I mean the story. And if the answer is yes, I would argue keep it in the narrative. Allow the detail about your methods to kind of flow organically. Because as we all know as sociologists, many times the decisions you make methodologically matter for the kind of theory that you're going to be working with. They certainly matter for the data that you'll be, in this case, expressing for the rest of the book. So I'm actually not a fan at the moment. This may change, but I'm not currently a fan of kind of taking any methodological detail and sort of deleting it from the main narrative and just sort of cordoning it off on page 250, full well knowing that most people who will pick up your book will never read a page of that methodology. I understand why people do that, and I certainly don't want to ignore that there are very real methodological struggles that that all of us, particularly ethnographers, have to go through. Issues of reflexivity, issues of positionality, issues of how you chose field sites and whatnot. These are all really important conversations. But in terms of the flow of the book and the story you're trying to tell, I think it's still really, really valuable to ask yourself, does the reader really need to know this in order to better understand, to move forward their own understanding of the narrative and the argument of the book?
I like that. That's a good... that's very helpful when I'm thinking about things. Yeah. Now, do you have any more questions about dissertation to book?
Nah, that's very good. Yeah, I do. I was curious why you chose NYU. Now I kind of see why with the New York audience. Perfect place.
So the issue of which press, once again, going back to there is a good deal of variation here. I do think that in ideal terms, you want to be driven by which presses seem to be putting out books that you love reading. And that's not just the content, but that's the style too. Again, these are things that I didn't really think about till I was kind of engaged in this process, but I would probably think the earlier you can keep in mind, does this book seem to flow right? Does the story unfold in a way that's really appealing to me? Or is it very choppy and maybe it's too narrative driven and you want a little bit more of that sort of citation heft and rich theory on the page and not in endnotes. Those are all decisions that every author has to make, and certain presses have a house style in how they deal with that. And so I'm of the belief that once you get past that and you have sort of a wish list of like, these are presses that I would love to see my book come out with, then it becomes a bit of the shopping around, right? Without naming names, I had a couple presses that I targeted. One, for one reason or another, didn't go all that well. And I say that only to say that sometimes your top choice or one of your top choices is not going to ultimately pan out. I know that some graduate students might have received the advice of, I'll be very careful about simultaneous submissions, right? In other words, submitting to one I adopt a bit more of a pragmatic approach. I think that presses understand the need to hedge your bets and sort of play the field in a basic, market sense. I do think that maybe a little bit of being upfront goes a long way. So in other words, maybe telling a press, hey, I know I reached out to you first. I'd love to publish with your press. Would you mind, would you mind if I also submit this? Or am I allowed to also submit this to a couple other presses just in case? From my experience, because those are words that are almost verbatim stuff that I sent out via email. Presses are not generally offended by that. I think they view this as just par for the course. This is business. So I would suggest submitting to maybe 2, possibly 3 presses, just to keep your options open and to make sure that you're not put in backed in the corner by trying to all eggs in one basket.
Can I ask you, you said that you had looked at some of the books that you enjoyed yourself and saw press names. Can I ask you what books that you enjoy that led you to NYU Press?
Yeah.
If they're at top of the mind. I mean,
yeah, sure. So I'll name a couple. I think early on in my career, the kind of books that I was reading and really enjoying, to this day I really enjoy. I love reading books. Well, for obvious reasons, I love Gary Allen Fine's Kitchens.
Yes.
And I love, so I love the flow of that, but I love how he balanced that ground level complexity of life in the kitchen with a lot of engagement with theory. In really, really interesting ways. It's still a brilliant book in my mind. Rachel Sherman's Class Acts was a big inspiration. I love the way that flowed. Also, I think similar in the kind of theoretical rigor, kind of introduced very upfront and then unpacked through this wonderful ethnographic detail. I think within NYU Press, I've been really, really impressed with the Latino series, edited by Pierrette Hontañez-Sotelo and Victor Rios. And Victor Rios's book is absolutely fantastic. And I think what really drew me to NYU Press, and I'm thinking specifically about Victor's book, is just how much the narrative, that compelling story, lived real life story, pushes the narrative forward. And then, you're introduced a little bit after, you're already engrossed, as a reader, you're already flipping the pages. And then you're seeing the sociological analysis come out. Then you're seeing the author, of course, connecting up to the theory. And to me, that was really inspirational to read just the flow of that book. So, again, different house styles in different presses. There are a number of other presses I could name with fantastic products as well.
Like we mentioned, you have an upcoming book called Front of the House, Back of the House. Can you give us a little bit more information about when it's coming out, as well as any social media people can come and contact you through?
Absolutely. Yeah, so my upcoming first book, which I'm very excited about, is coming out through NYU Press. It'll be out this December in 2020. And in addition to that, I am well underway starting a new project in which I've turned my attention on the craft beer industry, which is exploding all over the country. And I'm particularly interested in looking at labor dynamics and kind of cultural discourses that are within that industry. So I also have a Instagram account that's associated with research that I'm doing with a collaborator named Dr. Asa Stone, also from a scholar in New Mexico. And that Instagram is Beer and Society. Beer and Society, one word, and you can follow the latest research on the craft beer industry there.
You've been listening to the Annex, a sociology podcast. Thanks again, Dr. Wilson, for being on the show. We really appreciate it. So for more information about Dr. Wilson and his book, you can go to the Annex's website, which is sociocast.org/annex. You can also find us on Twitter, which is @SocAnnex. That's @SOCAnnex. And we're also on Facebook, which you can find us if you search the Annex Sociology Podcast. Thanks to Joe Cohen for letting Na and I host this episode, to the producer Elizabeth Moreno, and to the musical creator Lena Orsa. On behalf of both me and Na and the team here at the Annex, thank you, Dr. Wilson, for being on the show, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Have a great day.